Hello and welcome to Ahval Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on ahvalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to the Ahval Podcast. Today we have Daily Beast editor-at-large and co-author of New York Times bestseller ISIS Inside the Army of Terror, Michael Weiss. Michael Weiss, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on. I know that you are very busy. You have been following Syria from day one, when it was protests, then uprising, rebellion, civil war, proxy war, now invasions, and so on and so forth. So I am so glad that you made some time for us to discuss the situation. Let me start with my first question. Can you give us the general picture right now? How do you see events are unfolding on the ground?
Well, I'll be honest with you, it's a little bit tricky to keep track of developments because there's a lot of competing narratives and there's a lot of misinformation. It does seem to be the case that the Assad regime and really Russia have taken over an abandoned U.S. military installation in Manbij in Aleppo province. The extent to which the regime in Russia have seized all of Manbij remains to be seen, at least to me. I've seen indications that there's still some sporadic fighting on the ground between Turkish-backed Syrian rebel forces and the YPG. I've seen a lot of commentary about this, headlong dash for Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor on the part of Assad's army and his militias and proxies. But according to people on the ground in Raqqa, the regime really isn't there yet. And in fact, there's been a statement, I believe, issued by a citizens' council in Deir ez-Zor saying that they will not let the regime and its Iranian terror proxy in. But of course, they really have no choice if there's no U.S. presence and there's no air support to stop the regime from coming in. So broadly speaking, I think what we're seeing is the return of Damascus and its now manifold allies and partners to northeast Syria, or at least the parts that are not currently occupied by the Turkish military. You're seeing the carve-up of Syria, particularly in the borderland region, between and amongst three different actors: Erdoğan, president of Turkey; Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia; and one can say Bashar al-Assad, although at this point, funnily enough, I see Assad as more of a proxy of Iran and Russia than the other way around. So let us say actually two actors, Putin and Erdoğan, are essentially divvying up the spoils of America's withdrawal. But fundamentally, and as you mentioned, I've covered Syria from the beginning of the protest movement in 2011 and the beginning of the refugee crisis in 2011. I have never seen dynamics on the ground change as quickly and really as catastrophically as I've seen them do in the last week. And this includes, by the way, the blowing up of Assad's crisis cell in Damascus in, I think, 2012. This includes the use of sarin gas chemical weapons in Ghouta in 2013. This includes Obama famously walking down from his red line and cutting a deal with Russia in 2013. And this also includes the rise of ISIS in 2014. What you've seen in the last week is the abdication of the United States in the Middle East and the handover, not the salesmanship, there wasn't some kind of bartering or quid pro quo in terms of making a deal with Russia and with Tehran and with Ankara. The gifting of American influence and assets to what are now, in the case of Turkey, one can make the case that there's still some partnership and alliance there because it's a NATO power. But in the case of Moscow and Tehran, for sure, the gifting of American influence and assets to hostile entities, to hostile states, that the United States has been in a state of Cold War with for decades. So it's a disaster for the U.S. It's certainly a disaster for the YPG and Syrian Kurds. And it's going to be a disaster for the Arab tribes and the Sunni Arab population who constitute the demographic majority of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor.
I understand. Thank you so much for this. So Vice President Pence and the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, will be meeting with Erdoğan tomorrow, Thursday. They want for ceasefire. We don't know whether they can get a ceasefire, but what is your expectation?
I mean, look, I don't see. There's always a chance that Assad, in his infinite wisdom, is going to try to bite off more than he can chew. He's done this in the past. If there is some kind of broad agreement for the state of Manbij, the state of Kobani, Ras Al Ain is still seeing some fighting. You've got YPG militias fighting with Turkish backed proxies. If Assad thinks that he can maybe pull a fast one on Erdogan, I can well see the Turkish military not going to all-out war with the Assad regime, but bombing regime convoys, killing regime soldiers. They've done this in the past, right? You and I together were in Antakya at one point where you could see the hillside was completely charred black because of Turkish artillery shelling. From Syrian artillery shelling across the border into Turkey. What Turkey cannot afford to do, and what I don't see happening, is any kind of all-out confrontation with Russia. The skies of Syria now really belong to Turkey and to Russia. So in terms of a ceasefire, I mean, ceasefire is a sort of meaningless concept with respect to the Syria civil war. It has been for ages. These things don't last. They don't hold. The real challenge now for these states is to also control their proxies. Jaish al-Islam, which is a hardcore Salafi rebel group, which had formerly occupied a pretty wide area of eastern Damascus until they were expelled, is now embedded with the Turkish military and is headed to the border as part of this so-called new Syrian army. Jaish al-Islam are battle-hardened fighters. They're headed, I've seen video of a bunch of them in a bus headed now to the Syrian border. What are they going to do when they get there? Are they just going to sit on their heels and wait for instruction, or are they going to want to fight? And if they do deploy to an area where it's only a few meters away from a Syrian checkpoint or a Russian military or Russian police checkpoint, it's very easy to see some kind of skirmishing happen. So ceasefire, I don't expect much from that. The other consideration, of course, is now what are the former Syrian Democratic Forces, which were led by the YPG, what's going to happen to them as a paramilitary apparatus? And according to this deal that has been brokered with Russia, they are going to be incorporated into the 5th Battalion of the Syrian Army, which is really a Russian-built and run receptacle, as far as I can see, for abandoned U.S. proxy forces. So you've got a lot of guys from the Southern Front, which is one of the main consortium of Syrian rebels formerly backed by the United States in Deraa. When they reconciled with Assad, they were the guys who wanted to essentially flip and join the Syrian regime war campaign were put into the 5th Battalion. So you're going to see a lot of YPG stroke PKK fighters going in there. And then the real question from there becomes, where are they going to be deployed? No doubt Russia will use them to deploy to areas of Rojava, but no doubt also Russia is going to use these guys eventually to deploy to places like Homs and Idlib, where if I'm Putin and if I'm the Russian general staff, I see these PKK guys as very reliable, trustworthy, and capable fighters against insurgency. They fought ISIS in Syria's northeast. Now they're going to be probably sent to fight Al-Qaeda and other rebel groups in Syria's northwest. So the question from that then becomes, are they going to want to be used as Russia's counterterrorism proxy? They fought with the Americans, and they fought valiantly and nobly, but they also fought with their own political considerations. US F-16s in the sky and Delta Force on the ground were helping them build this semi-autonomous Kurdish statelet called Rojava. Russia is not going to help them build that. Russia is going to make them subordinate to the broader enterprise of Syrian state reconstitution. I mean, the relationship between Damascus and the PKK, as you well know, has always been a rather fraught one. Yes, they've been used by Assad, and particularly by Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father, as a kind of deterrent factor with respect to Turkey. But the PKK never got nearly as much out of Damascus as they had gotten out of Washington in the last 5-6 years of this anti-ISIS campaign. So are they going to feel now they're desperate, and they're somewhat relieved that they've got another sort of broad alliance or coalition willing to back them against this Turkish invasion. But they're going to feel cheated very soon, because the deal that they've struck with Moscow is not nearly as beneficial to themselves as the deal that they had going with Washington.
So let me ask this. This is obviously the hottest topic in Washington with regards to these Turkey discussions. There is one argument that U.S. did the right thing in 2014, 2015. There was nobody else but the Syrian Kurds, YPG, PKK offshoot to work with, and they were very capable, as you explained here. And the other argument is people like Mike Duran has been defending this, that U.S. should never work with these guys. These guys are the terrorist organizations, and what Trump did as a withdrawal is the right decision. So I'm very much curious about your opinion. In 2014-15, obviously you were again very closely following. Was there another alternative for U.S. to work? And let's start with that, and then I'll do the follow-up.
Well, so the first way to answer this question is not to start in 2014 and 2015. I think this is a sort of analytical fallacy that we all fall into when we assume that the Syria crisis began with the sacking of Mosul by ISIS and essentially the fanning out of this so-called caliphate, and then the U.S. scrambling to find a credible proxy force to wage its ground campaign against ISIS. The crisis began in 2011, as you know. The U.S. Rhetorically called for Bashar al-Assad's ouster. The CIA, at one point in around 2012, 2013, began covertly arming and backing and financing about 40-plus Syrian rebel groups, not with the idea of overthrowing the dictatorship in Damascus, but putting military pressure to try and advance the so-called Geneva protocols or the Geneva process to negotiate his surrender from the throne. And in fact, that program, the CIA program, as I reported, as others reported, the way it worked is, and it was working in conjunction with the Turkish government, by the way, and Turkish intelligence. Every time the rebels were too successful or they creeped up a little too far, particularly in the southern Damascus region, the supply lines got cut. The ammunition spigot was turned off. So the rebels were kept on a rather tight leash throughout that covert aspect of American intervention. But broadly, what the U.S. had intended was, again, diplomacy to get rid of the regime, or to get rid of rather it wasn't regime change per se, it was regime decapitation, because a lot of the actors in the government, in the intelligence services, in the military were to remain. It was just Bashar al-Assad as the face of this carnage, as the face of this humanitarian catastrophe had to go. That effort failed. When ISIS came to power, the U.S. was now faced with a national security priority of, we're not in Syria, we're not going to stay in Syria to fight Assad. We have one exclusive objective, and that is to roll back this army of terror. They found themselves at this point, again, they had a consortium of different rebel groups that they were backing covertly. And then they decided, let's try and repurpose these rebel groups, which were largely Sunni Arab. There were some, ethnic minorities, Turkmen in the north and so on, but mostly Sunni Arabs, let's repurpose them into our counterterrorism strike force, the Foreign Legion of U.S. Special Forces, if you like. The problem with that, of course, was political. These rebel groups, their raison d'etre was to fight Assad, not to go fight America's war on terror. The Pentagon inaugurated what was known as the Train and Equip program, which, as far as I could tell at the time, and I did a lot of reporting on it, was dead on arrival. So essentially they would take Free Syrian Army cadres, vet them, give them some training, equip them with some material, both defensive and lethal weaponry, and dispatch them into Syria to go and fight ISIS. A lot of these graduates from the program, in one case I remember reporting on, the head of the the conceptualization of the program itself was deeply flawed. In other words, for instance, the heads of these Free Syrian Army groups would not be part of the technical train and equip program, but they would remain the heads of the group. So they'd be dispatched into the country without really having signed on the dotted line with the United States. The rank and file guys would be American proxies, but the commander of the Katiba would not. So in one instance, literally, the commander of one of these Katibas went in, took his guys, and basically made off with American gear and weaponry and handed it off to the Nusra al-Qaeda guys in Aleppo province in exchange for some kind of power sharing program or whatever agreement he struck. So the Pentagon Train and Equip program, dead on arrival, a complete catastrophe. And yes, the United States found itself after the siege of Kobani, when the YPG was by itself holding the ground against an ISIS onslaught. Eventually, the United States intervened, this is 2014, on the side of the YPG, and then found the YPG to be capable and reliable and trustworthy. And yes, all too willing to partner with the United States to fight ISIS. Now, the YPG did this for various reasons. Now, first and foremost, they faced an existential crisis because ISIS wanted to kill them. ISIS considers the YPG, and as you know, I mean, the YPG is the Syrian arm of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is at one point a Marxist-Leninist insurgency, separatist organization. I understand the ideology has shifted. The Marxism has sort of fallen by the wayside, but they're deeply secular, deeply feminist, all of the things that ISIS loathes. ISIS calls them atheists and considers them kuffar. So the YPG had to fight ISIS to survive, but the YPG also saw a rare opportunity here. The world's only superpower was going to arm them, give them close air support to fight ISIS in exactly the area of Syria, northeastern Syria, where the YPG consider this the ground, the terrain of a future independent state of Kurdistan, or at least the Syrian quarter of it, known as Rojava. So they had their own state-building enterprise on the back of America's counterterrorism enterprise. Was the U.S. wrong to partner with them? No, because as you point out, I mean, they were desperate. We needed a credible ground army against ISIS, and these were the only comers. The problem, though, was the policy, the short-sightedness leading up to that point, the point at which ISIS had risen to such prominence in Syria and Iraq, had led us to absolutely have no other skin in the game, no other people on the ground who were willing to work with us, such as the YPG. Now, objectively speaking, people like Mike Durant have a point, and I've written this, and other people have also noted this. Because the YPG is essentially the PKK, there was always a geopolitical contradiction built into America's war against ISIS, and that was we are relying on a proxy force that Washington considers a terrorist organization, but Ankara especially considers a terrorist organization because Ankara and the PKK have been at war with each other for 40 years. And the PKK has blown up police stations and army barracks and so on and so forth inside Turkey. So Turkish officials at the time, beginning in 2014, but all throughout, and this cuts a wide swath across the Turkish political and security establishment. This isn't just AKP, this isn't just Erdoğan, have said to the United States that for us, meaning the Turks, this is like, this would be tantamount to our sending Al-Qaeda to Juarez, Mexico, to fight the drug cartels. How would America feel if we sent terrorists to do the bidding of our national interest against another larger terrorist organization. So Turkey's consideration was the PKK is a bigger national security threat than either Nusra or ISIS or any of the other Syrian rebel groups who indeed have now partnered with Turkey. So this confrontation between Washington and Ankara was always, it was inevitable. It was always going to happen. The question, though, is, did it have to happen like this? And the answer is no. Okay, Donald Trump gave Tayyip Erdoğan a green light, full stop. This wasn't a flashing yellow light. This wasn't a sort of, well, what are we going to do? The Turks have mobilized. They're going to invade. If the United States had mobilized, had sent its 1,000 U.S. forces inside Syria to the border, Turkey would not now be intervening in northeast Syria. So it didn't have to go this way. And the U.S. position, and I've interviewed people from the State Department and those who've been working on this, the U.S. position was, we understand Turkey's concerns. Privately, U.S. officials would acknowledge that, yes, America is being very hypocritical by denying for several years that the YPG were the PKK, by, for instance, rebranding the YPG as the Syrian Democratic Forces as a PR exercise. This fooled no one in Turkey, right? And it only exacerbated the problem. It only made the Turkish security establishment more angry at the United States for lying about who their proxies were. But the State Department and the Pentagon were working with Ankara to try and resolve this crisis, first and foremost by introducing a joint security mechanism at the border, which would limit the YPG contingent and create a sort of power sharing program so that Turkey didn't feel threatened, that it had a kind of de facto buffer zone without a full-scale invasion. The long-term goal for an indefinite U.S. military deployment in northeast Syria, and also, frankly, just eastern Syria, the Euphrates River Valley, was to reconstitute the Syrian Democratic Forces to make it more demographically diverse. Now, it is the case that you have plenty of Arabs. There's a rough parity demographically between Kurd and Arab within the rank and file of the SDF, and there's been a lot of good research done on this. However, no one can deny that the PKK run the show at the command level. You know, these are hardened fighters from this, again, 40-year insurgency against Turkey, whether they're Syrian or they're Turkish, meaning they come from Turkey, or indeed they're from the Kandil Mountains in Iraq. This was a PKK-led endeavor. So again, you have a variety of different policy decisions beginning in 2011, continuing to 2014, that crisis point, that inflection point when ISIS became the international security problem, all the way up to a week ago when Donald Trump took the call from the Turkish president and basically said, you know what, I am abdicating to you. Yeah. You guys sort this out. This is your fight.
Let me ask this way. Do you think the Turkish invasion, which Mr. Erdoğan doesn't like to hear the word of invasion, justified after the big efforts of this security mechanism, all these talks? Do you think that Ankara tried to talk to Syrian Kurds or tried to solve this problem peacefully, or they had just no interest because this is some kind of a national security threat, if not now, in some future time, and the Turkey is justified doing this?
Look, I mean, you have only to look at the way Turkey has intervened in Syria, and the kind of groups it's relying upon to do so, to see that Turkey is not really being a good faith actor here either. For instance, the new Syrian army, as it's known, which is the consortium of different Syrian rebel groups that Turkey is using as its own battering ram against the YPG, consists of, on the one hand, by my count, 21 different factions that had formerly been backed by the United States, whether by the CIA or the Pentagon in various states or stages of the Syrian civil war. That's interesting, right? Because it means that Turkey is relying, at least in part, on former U.S. proxies to go after a now former U.S. proxy, the YPG. That's an aspect of this confrontation or this development that hasn't really gotten much due in the Western press, but should. But on the other hand, some of the other groups that Turkey is relying on to wage this campaign are Islamist/jihadist groups, right? Jaish al-Islam, which was headquartered really in Ghouta in Damascus. The one thing they had going for them, they were deeply sectarian. They put Syrian Alawites in cages. They were nasty bunch of fighters. The one thing they had going for them, however, was they kept the ground free from ISIS. So call it what you will, the narcissism of the tiny difference, but they were a credible deterrent against ISIS. But there are other groups that Turkey is aligned with, which are not credible deterrents against ISIS, and which, frankly, ideologically are quite sympathetic to ISIS. I've been seeing videos in the last week showing some of these rebels and Islamists, giving the sign for remaining, which was a famous ISIS slogan: remaining and then expanding. There's been talk among U.S. intelligence, and there was a piece in foreign policy that some of these groups are letting ISIS prisoners out of jail in northeast Syria. So no, and this goes to the heart of the matter, which is Turkey was never really all that exercised about Salafi jihadism, and to some degree, and I think there's now indisputable evidence to suggest, to some degree, has even aligned with Salafi jihadism to combat what it sees as its mortal security problem, and that is the PKK. The United States, though, and this is the most important thing, and people who say we need to kick Turkey out of NATO or we need to now turn completely against Turkey, look, the U.S. approach toward the Middle East has always struck me as that of an idiot savant. The United States can learn to do one thing exceptionally well. In this case, kill jihadists. Kill the guys dressed in black who like to chop people's heads off. We are past masters at this. The one thing, though, that the United States has failed to do, and that almost is kind of a bumbling incompetent, is to work with states and get them really aligned with the U.S. interest. In other words, we forfeit geopolitics in pursuit of counterterrorism. And that has been the case, by the way, not just under Donald Trump, but certainly under President Obama, his predecessor. The U.S., so long as it was still in Syria, so long as it was still in northeast Syria, could have stopped Turkey from doing what it did on the basis alone of this is a NATO allied country. Turkey cannot invade and start killing American soldiers. Full stop. The U.S. had a deterrent capability against its friend, not just against its enemies. That's now been squandered because Donald Trump decided, in his infinite wisdom, that the United States has no role to play in this part of the world. The Middle East, as he put it, is a place of death and sand and oil that the United States simply isn't stealing from other countries. So he wants Turkey to sort it out with the Kurds and with Assad and with the Iranians and with the Russians. And as I said earlier, this is a carve-up. There will be some modus vivendi when the dust settles here. But in the meantime, you're going to see sectarian bloodletting. You're going to see ethnic cleansing. You're going to see the release of ISIS jihadists from prison. You're going to see ISIS not reconstitute itself as a caliphate or a state-building enterprise, but certainly it's already reconstituted itself as an insurgency, which is what it's good at, frankly. It's not good at administering terrain. It's good at blowing stuff up. The United States will be back in the Middle East. It hasn't left completely. This U.S. garrison is now bivouacked in Al-Tanf, which is a military base in Homs in more central southern Syria, close to the Jordanian border. But the U.S. is going to have to intervene again. And this is what Donald Trump doesn't seem to understand. And this is what his core constituency, which is applauding him for this decision, also doesn't understand. It's not just about killing jihadists. If you don't maintain a presence, facts on the ground, as it's euphemistically known in this neighborhood, you don't maintain a presence to ensure not only that jihadists don't come back, but that the socio-political conditions which allow them to come there in the first place aren't, given free rein. Counterterrorism, it becomes an endless war. It becomes a case of just infinite regression.
Well, it looks like Trump believes Erdoğan more than his own institutions.
He does.
Pentagon, and I think Erdoğan knows very well how to convince Trump. Going forward, this is going to be my final question, and thank you so much for this really very deep history of Syrian rebellion and Syrian crisis. So Erdoğan now saying that he's not going to abide by any kind of ceasefire. I think he has all the intentions to go all the way to the Iraqi border. It's apparently about 444 kilometers and 35 kilometers deep. Do you envision, this apparently includes Kobani, and it looks like a senior U.S. official, military official, already told one of the American journalists that Turkish forces or Turkey-backed militias are coming closer to Kobani. Do you envision that Turkey can take this whole land, can it grab it and hold it for,
Well, Turkey can take land that Russia hasn't already taken. So the question is, and I should caveat that Turkey can take land that Russia hasn't already taken, and that Russia isn't willing to forfeit to Turkey as part of some grand bargain. So what remains to be seen, for instance, about Minbij is there is a Russian military and police presence there, which is deterring a full-on Turkish onslaught and capture of the city. Will Russia negotiate Minbij away to Ankara in exchange for something else? Kobani, look, if I'm Vladimir Putin, what am I thinking right now? Okay, the PKK/YPG, they're down on their knees, they're desperate, they're looking to Russia to be the salvation of the Kurds. I'm willing to give them that up to a point, right? I want the PR, I want the optics of Russia swooping in and scooping up this American proxy, Russia swooping in and providing a security blanket to protect the Kurds of Syria, everyone's favorite, ethnic group. They're secular, they're Western-minded and orientated in their values and so on, against Erdoğan and his mad Islamist dash for a neo-Ottoman empire, whatever. That's the salesmanship from Moscow. The reality, though, from Moscow will be, look, we don't want the PKK to be a powerful, semi-autonomous organization in Syria. We don't want that because our client, Bashar al-Assad, does not want that, and also, frankly, Russia wants to be the most powerful state actor in Syria, and it doesn't need a bunch of non-state actors running around, defying the will of this sort of axis that has now formed to save Assad. They keep talking about territorial integrity and borders. So what they're going to do is, as I said, they're going to melt the PKK into the broader Syrian/Russian security structures that have emerged in the last few years since Russia intervened in 2015. They're going to keep them at heel. They're going to use them as they wish against other groups, like, as I mentioned, Al-Qaeda in Idlib, but they're not going to allow them to have what they had under the Americans. So if I'm the Russian government and if I'm Putin, I'm thinking one way to send a signal to Syrian Kurds that there's a new sheriff in town and, what you had before is now at an end, would be to give Erdoğan and to give Turkey Kobani. Why? Kobani has no strategic significance to anyone, but it has huge symbolic significance to Syrian Kurds because that was their Stalingrad in the war against ISIS, right? And that's where America first intervened to save them. If Kobani fell into Ankara's hands and you saw a bunch of Syrian rebel groups lift the Free Syrian flag in that city, and Erdogan got up and gave a speech that we have recaptured this sort of citadel of Kurdish resistance, I think that would send a signal to Syrian Kurds that, their fortunes have been completely reversed. Now they are a wholly owned subsidiary of a collection of states that, will use them and will give them some dispensations, but is never going to allow them to get what they had under the United States.
Wow. So, okay. Well, this was a very interesting and very important analysis.
By the way, I don't say that's necessarily how it's going to go.
I understand.
I'm just saying, if I was in Putin's position, that would be my calculation. Give Turkey.
Apparently, Trump made Erdogan promise that he's not going to go for it. But do you think Americans have any leverage at this point to stop?
No, I don't think they do. Erdogan just today came out and said, "I'm not going to meet with Vice President Pence. Why should I?
Yeah.
I'll wait for Trump." And even waiting for Trump at this point, I mean, who cares? America doesn't have leverage. It just squandered its leverage in Syria. The only thing America can do that Turkey will want is lift sanctions. But you know what? If Russia and Iran have shown anything in this conflict, and Assad himself, is that American sanctions don't stop sanctioned entities and sanctioned states from escalating their activities in Syria. And they're sure as hell not going to stop Turkey from doing so.
But definitely Turkey doesn't have the kind of natural resources that Iran and Russia has, and very fragile economy. And
no, but they have two trading partners in Russia and Iran. And, right. By the way, I mean, Turkish state and non-state actors are guilty of evading Iranian sanctions. And so I would expect to see that, come to the fore now. By the way, Iran has looked traditionally to Iraq as its way to skirt international sanctions. The U.S. isn't going to impose crippling sectoral sanctions on Turkey. If it didn't impose them on Russia after Crimea, it's not going to do so on Turkey after an invasion that was authorized by the President of the United States. I think Trump is doing these sanctions as a kind of milksop to bipartisan fury in Congress about what Turkey is up to. But you're not going to see, I don't think the Turkish economy is going to be destroyed, as Trump's tweeted, a week ago. That's not in the cards here. And if it were, that would be the height of hypocrisy and stupidity, because again, the U.S. could have stopped this invasion and it chose not to. In fact, it allowed it to happen. It gave tacit encouragement for it to happen. Right. So why would you then cripple the Turkish economy for Turkey doing what you just told them they could do?
I think that's because Trump did it by himself, and Congress and all the other institutions are now really angry, and they want to punish Turkey, and Trump cannot.
Sure, but the other consideration of all this, and perhaps it's the most important from the American perspective. So now America has ceded its own national security file to Turkey, Iran, Russia, and Syria, meaning the regime. So 4 actors, 4 states, one of whom is still kind of an ally, but not really. 3 of whom are hostile, longtime enemies. These guys, these 4 states now control American national security in Syria, meaning they can decide whether or not ISIS steals across the border from Turkey into Turkey and then into Europe, where, by the way, they don't even have to come to America to kill Americans who travel abroad, and so on and so forth. Erdoğan has cards to play. He already threatened at the beginning of this invasion to basically dispatch all of these refugees into Europe, which I took to be a not so subtle threat, by the way, of also sending in jihadists back into Europe. Because as you know, a lot of the former ISIS fighters who fled during the collapse of the caliphate to Turkey and live pretty much out in the open in Turkey. They're sitting in apartments in Hatay province and so on. Some of them are in Istanbul. Some of them have been repurposed by the Turks either as intelligence assets or indeed dispatched now into northeast Syria under the banner of the new Syrian forces or the new Syrian army. So Erdogan has also a lot of leverage against the United States right now. Skin in the game in Syria, but also as the gatekeeper of this border, he can threaten the U.S. I'll just start sending terrorists at you. And what's Trump going to do then? I mean, the only thing that can really derail Trump's re-election campaign, I mean, I'm reading a lot of stuff, Syria is the end of Trump. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. Most Americans, they're going to see this as a tragedy for the Kurds. The news cycle is all about American withdrawal and abandonment, the decline of American, stature in the region, and blah, blah, blah. But most voters only care about one thing, which is, are we being blown up? And the one thing that can derail Donald Trump's re-election campaign in that respect is we start getting blown up again. And the people who can decide that or can play a indirect/direct role in facilitating that are, as I mentioned, Damascus, Moscow, Tehran, and Ankara.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Hopefully we might be able to do this next week if things, will continue the way they've been going. I think I will want to press a little more on you next time on this YPG PKK question. And thanks so much for this. This has been a really insightful and much appreciated.
Sure.